Hi, I'm Catherine Engelhart-Kronk, and I'm visiting here today with Gary Godsey. Welcome back, Gary. Glad you're here.
Glad I'm here too.
We are spending some time visiting about helping nonprofits transform their organizations in the 21st century. And we've had some interesting discussions both about transformation, alignment, and utilizing volunteers. And what I'd like to talk about today, based on my both personal experience and my experience with my nonprofit customers, is this whole issue of raising funds, making sure your funding base is diversified, not letting money lead. Big problem for nonprofits. I know you know a lot about this, and I'm just going to ask you to sort of take off and give us some words of wisdom about how can nonprofits do a better job of keeping their organizations funded, especially in these very tough economic times.
Yeah, okay. I'll tell you a little story.
Okay.
Recently I was asked by a CEO of a major Fortune 500 company, why do we have so many nonprofits? I mean,
it's a good question.
It's an open-ended question, I know, but he said, why is there a proliferation of nonprofits at the rate that they're going? Are the social issues such that it requires that many? And I said, no, I don't think that's the reason. I said, I think you're the reason. And it kind of took him aback. And he said, what do you mean by that? There were 30 CEOs at a breakfast meeting. He was asking the question. And I thought, this is a golden opportunity for me to be brutally honest with something I've been thinking about a long time. His company gives out hundreds of $5,000 to $10,000 checks to every agency who shows up at their door throughout the year. Many of the agencies in that pool of people that get those resources show up to 30 other corporations' doors, and they figured out how to go around and get $5,000 and $10,000 increments to keep their agency alive, and haven't paid any attention to other sources of revenue, diversifying their funding base, finding out what they need to do in order to be successful in the future, besides depending on these 15 to 20, $10,000, $5,000 to $10,000 pops every year that come like clockwork to them. So I told the corporate leaders, I said, the proliferation of nonprofits is partially your fault because you continue to give to people without asking key questions and without demanding specific metrics about what happened to the money you gave.
But even if they do, let's say that they do ask those questions. They say, what did you do with my $10,000? What would you recommend that corporate executive do? Give many fewer larger grants?
I am a firm believer that if now we're switching topics just a little bit, but if a corporation wants to achieve, which I think every corporation in America now, virtually all of them want to align philanthropy with their corporate strategies. Mm-hmm. They want metrics that matter. That's really important. They don't want just verbiage.
Right.
They want to see results for what happens to the resources they give. And the third thing is they want to involve their employees, either as volunteers, right, or decision makers.
That's a clear trend.
They cannot do that by giving away $5,000 and $10,000 a whack gifts to 1,000 nonprofits. So my belief, and I think I'm seeing this around the country now, is certainly corporations who have these huge philanthropic agendas have started to give fewer small grants and more large grants, with the intent on getting the needle to move on things that they're really concerned about.
Okay, and I understand that, and I understand why that's important, but what about the small nonprofit that's listening to us talk, and they're saying to themselves, if I don't get those little grants, I have to close the door.
Yeah.
So
I'm not suggesting.
I know you're not,
yeah,
but if that's the trend, and I think it is the trend,
yeah,
what happens to the small guys? What do they do?
That's good. They have to diversify their revenue sources, which is exactly what we're talking about. So if you've been used to getting those grants forever and keeping your doors open, I'm not saying this has to happen overnight, but you've got to start thinking about ways to diversify revenue beyond your one source. And I would call that their one source. And someone's going to say, well, how do I do that? Well, you put your thinking cap on, you put your teams of volunteers together, you put, if you've got development staff, you charge your development staff with saying, over the next number of months or even couple of years, we want to move from this revenue mix to this revenue mix and come up with a strategy to support that and begin implementing it. It doesn't have to occur overnight. The organization that I last ran basically got all of its money from corporate America and individuals who worked in the workplace. And we saw a trend coming a decade ago which said that's going to dry up. So we moved to 3 or 4 other key diversified fundraising areas.
What were they?
Online. Online is not a quick fix, but it's a way to identify potential donors and get them engaged with your organization. That's key.
And you see a lot of nonprofits, especially small ones, who do go online because it's very inexpensive now to get a little widget, on your website. But they're still not raising money, and I think it's because they don't tell their story.
It goes back hand in hand. And also, expecting someone just to give you money online is probably not a good expectation initially, but expecting someone to want to know more about your organization and then engaging that individual online leads to resources on down the line. So our strategy was never to raise a bunch of money online initially. It was to get people in the pipeline.
Right.
Build a pipeline of future donors. Number 2 was to stick our foot in the grants pool.
And most nonprofit organizations have more than a foot in the grant pool.
So
they're doing a lot of grant writing.
Good. So they have they're beginning, either that's a piece of their diversity strategy or it's not. If it's not, you probably should consider some of that. And if you don't have staff to do that, you can find people who you could put on a retainer to do that.
That, or, I've done a lot of grant writing in my life, and you can make grant writing relatively simple by creating a template that tells your story and has every piece of information about what you do and who you serve and your success metrics. And you sort of just mix and match it as you write grants so that it fits with those requirements. I think people think of grant writing as I have to have a team of people doing this, and you don't.
Right.
You don't.
You really
so
don't.
I think that's a good point.
Special event fundraising, hard, very hard to do, but for some agencies, it's a perfect fit. It's maybe something that they haven't attempted to do before, and it may be that they have people on their volunteer team now who could bring an expertise around something like that and introduce an event for that organization. Direct mail fundraising. Even though it's usually not a big response rate, some of those things can tend to bring in more resources than you would ever invest.
So you're going to need organization name recognition for that to work. If you're a very small nonprofit that no one's heard of because you're new or you're in a very narrow niche, I think you're going to have a hard time with direct mail. That and the fact that direct mail is so expensive.
It's pretty expensive.
The printing, the stamps.
Pretty expensive.
One thing that I would like to add is that it's well known that people who volunteer, when they become engaged as volunteers, back to what you were saying before, and they understand what is expected of them and they feel like they've succeeded and they're engaged, will give you money.
Well, that was going to be my next point, was engaged people, your volunteers or otherwise, should be targets for making monetary contributions to your organization. I like affinity group fundraising too. And what I mean
Tell
by
me about that.
Affinity group fundraising, it goes against maybe what society kind of believes is supposed to be the right way to do things now, but I do know that having groups of people who are alike in terms of either ethnicity or gender or interest There's a lot of power behind that. Some of the most successful giving societies in America today are women. Women's giving societies, women's leadership councils, African American leadership giving, African American leadership councils. And those things do really, really well because not only do they get a consensus around things that they're concerned about, generally speaking, but they then build a network of people who can support your work in ways beyond just giving their financial contributions. And the youth, in the last 2 organizations I've been in, we've started youth councils that ended up not with the notion of getting dollars initially, but getting engagement, which then led to dollars. And that's what I talk about when I talk about don't let the money lead. Far too often, agencies, organizations, nonprofits decide, oh, we need to go raise money. We're going to go put this special event together, and our goal is X. It would have been much easier for them a few years or even months back to say, we need to go build a pipeline of potential donors into the organization, cultivate a relationship with them, involve them in volunteer activities within our organization, show them results on a regular basis about what happens to the work, to the people that we're serving, and then ask for the resources. But as you pointed out early on, they're in a vicious circle of trying to make payroll, of trying to make ends meet, and they just believe that they don't have time to do that. You've got to make time for developing relationships.
Because that is really what brings funding dollars to your organization.
The identity of your organization, understanding what it stands for, being able to tell your story, and cultivating quality relationships will lead to dollars on the other end.
That is extremely, extremely helpful. One of the last things that I want to talk about briefly and for just a minute is the fact that that whole issue of don't let money lead, I see happening, and I must admit as executive director I did it. I would fit my program description or project to meet the requirements of a particular grant. And then that grant would run out and I would kind of be stuck because I couldn't reasonably go somewhere else and get that funding. And I think that's another one of those cat chasing their tail things that executive directors do in a desperate effort to keep the doors open.
That's called mission creep. When you do that, that's, I'll tweak my mission a little bit.
Exactly.
So I can get something in the door here. If you do a good job of strategizing about who you are, what your organization stands for, what are the requirements, the financial and other requirements that are going to be needed in order to go get this work done in the community. You've got a strategic plan,
right?
Which I bet you 75% of the organizations in America don't have a strategic plan. Or if they do, they've got it on catching dust somewhere. But the ones that are successful are the ones that have a continuous, kind of a measured approach. They know their business, they know their organization, they build a relationship with donors and non-donors, and ultimately end up getting resources they need to run the organization on a long-term view.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot, Gary.
Welcome.